The email hit Ethan Cole's inbox at exactly 9:04 a.m. Urgent. Meet with Richard Kane, 9:15 a.m., 21st floor. Ethan stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He'd been at Kane Industries for 6 years and had never been summoned to the CEO's office before. It wasn't the kind of meeting you wanted to get called into, not when whispers were already circling the office about budget cuts and mass layoffs. He closed his laptop slowly, grabbed his worn leather notebook, and headed for the elevators. The ride up felt suffocating. Ethan could see his reflection in the brushed steel walls of the elevator, square jaw tense, dark hair slightly disheveled from rushing to work, and those tired brown eyes that still carried the hope that honesty could change things. He knew why Richard Kane wanted to see him, and he knew the conversation wasn't going to end well. Richard's office looked more like a museum than a workplace. Glass walls, mahogany bookshelves lined with awards, and a panoramic view of the city skyline that made anyone walking in feel small. "Mr. Cole," Richard said without looking up from his desk, his voice clipped and cold.
"Seat."
Ethan did. Richard finally looked up, his piercing blue eyes narrowing. "I've reviewed your latest compliance report. Care to explain why you flagged the Helios project as, what was the word you used? Ethically unsound?" Ethan met his gaze. "Because it is." Richard's lips tightened. "That project is worth $80 million in projected revenue. We've already secured half the investors. Your little report could tank the entire deal." "With all due respect," Ethan said carefully, "we're exploiting communities overseas by paying below subsistence wages. The environmental impact alone." Richard held up a hand. "Spare me the sermon. You were hired to make the numbers work, not to question my business decisions." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I was hired to keep this company honest. At least, that's what you told me in my interview." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "And I appreciate your convictions. But convictions don't pay salaries. Investors don't care about your moral compass. They care about profit." Ethan's heart sank. He knew where this was going. "You're a good analyst," Richard said, "but you're not a team player. And I can't have someone in my company who undermines our growth." "You're firing me," Ethan said flatly. Richard didn't flinch. "Effective immediately. HR will process your severance. Security will escort you out." The words hit like a gut punch. Ethan rose slowly, keeping his voice steady. "One day, this obsession with profits is going to cost you everything, Richard." Richard smirked. "We'll see." By noon, Ethan was standing outside Kane Industries with a cardboard box in his arms. It felt surreal. The same building where he'd poured 6 years of his life now loomed behind him like a monument to betrayal. Inside the box were fragments of a career he'd built with integrity, framed certificates, a coffee mug Sophie had given him on his first day, a couple of sticky notes with reminders he'd never need again.
Sophie.
His sister was going to be devastated. She'd already been worried about his mounting credit card debt and the student loans he was still paying off. He sat on a bench near the bus stop, scrolling through his contacts. When he finally pressed Sophie's name, his throat tightened. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan? Everything okay?" "I got fired," he said quietly. "Oh, Ethan?" Her voice cracked, and it hurt worse than Richard's cold dismissal. "What happened?" He explained everything. The report, the confrontation, the box of belongings. Sophie listened silently, her breaths uneven. "You did the right thing," she said finally. "You always do." "That's not paying the bills," Ethan muttered. When he hung up, he felt hollow. He didn't know how long he sat there, watching buses come and go. It wasn't until his phone buzzed with a text from his old friend Mark Johnson that he stirred. "Heard what happened. Meet me at O'Malley's tonight. 7 p.m. drinks on me." Ethan sighed. He didn't feel like celebrating or even talking, but he couldn't stand the thought of another night alone in his tiny apartment. O'Malley's was crowded and noisy, the kind of place where no one cared if you looked like the world had just chewed you up and spit you out. Mark was already at the bar when Ethan arrived, his sleeves rolled up and a beer in hand. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Man, you look like hell." "Thanks," Ethan said dryly. Mark ordered him a drink and leaned in.
I'm sorry, Mom.
But honestly, you're better off. Kane Industries was a sinking ship anyway. Richard's been cutting corners for years. Ethan frowned. You think the company's in trouble? I know it is, Mark said. Half the senior staff are looking for other jobs. And there's a rumor the SEC is sniffing around the Helios project. Ethan's heart skipped. The one I flagged? Mark nodded.
Yeah.
Word is, Kane pushed it through too fast, and now some investor leaked documents to the feds. If that blows up, it could take the whole company down. Ethan stared at his drink. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, all he felt was a dull ache. Because he knew the fallout wouldn't just hurt Richard Kane. It would hurt the employees who had no say in these decisions, the same people he'd worked alongside for years. When he finally left the bar, the city air felt heavier. He walked home slowly, past shuttered storefronts and flickering streetlights, replaying every word of his conversation with Richard. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe honesty really didn't matter in this world. But deep down, Ethan knew one thing. If Kane Industries was about to crumble, he didn't want to stand by and watch. He wanted to build something better. Something no one could take away. The next morning, he opened his laptop and stared at the blank screen. His bank account balance mocked him from the corner of the screen. But instead of browsing job listings, Ethan began typing. An idea had been gnawing at him for months, an idea Richard had shot down repeatedly because it wasn't profitable enough. It was a business plan. A small, sustainable company focused on doing the exact opposite of Kane Industries: ethical sourcing, fair wages, and products people could actually trust. Ethan didn't know if it would work, but he knew it was worth trying. Across the city, in his glass-walled office, Richard Kane stood watching the skyline when Derek Walsh burst in, pale and sweating. "Richard, we have a problem." Richard turned slowly. "What kind of problem?" "The SEC just froze our accounts. They've opened a full investigation into Helios." Richard's face drained of color, and for the first time in years, the untouchable CEO felt the ground crack beneath his feet. The following morning, Ethan sat in his cramped apartment with a chipped mug of coffee and his laptop glowing on the table. His tiny living room smelled faintly of burnt toast, and the late winter light streaming through the blinds did nothing to warm the space. But Ethan didn't feel cold. For the first time in weeks, he felt determined. He had stayed up nearly all night, fleshing out the idea that had been gnawing at him for months. His business plan was now more than scribbled notes. It was a 20-page document outlining how he could launch a company that did everything Kane Industries refused to do: pay workers a living wage, use sustainable resources, and create products that made a real difference. The name came to him just as dawn broke.
Tronor's Solution.
He didn't have investors. He didn't even have much savings left. But he had his integrity and a belief that there were still people out there who cared about honesty in business. And he had Sophie. When his sister dropped by later that morning, bringing a bag of groceries, she found him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. "You're building something," she said softly, peering over his shoulder. "I'm trying," Ethan replied. Sophie scanned the documents, then looked at him. "You're really going to do this? I can't keep applying to companies that treat people like numbers. If I'm going to fail, at least I'll fail on my own terms." Sophie squeezed his shoulder. "Then you won't fail." By the end of the week, Ethan had set up a small home office and reached out to Mark Johnson, his old colleague at Kane Industries. Mark didn't hesitate. "I'm in," he said over the phone. "I was planning to leave anyway. Richard's running that place into the ground." "Then you're my first hire," Ethan said. "We're starting small, but we'll build this the right way." Mark chuckled. "Sounds better than cleaning up Kane's messes." "What's the first step?" "Clients," Ethan said. "We need one good project to prove ourselves." Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Richard Kane was having the worst week of his life. The SEC had frozen company accounts pending their investigation into the Helios project, and several major investors had already pulled out. News outlets were circling like vultures, and employees were panicking as rumors of bankruptcy spread through the glass towers of Kane Industries. In the boardroom, Richard slammed a folder down on the table. "I want solutions, not excuses," he barked. Derek Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "We can't move money with the accounts frozen. And several senior staff have resigned. Clara Evans in HR, two of the compliance directors." "Cowards," Richard snapped. But deep down, a seed of fear had begun to grow. Because Ethan Cole had warned him. "Sir," Derek said carefully, "the media's painting this like you ignored your analyst's report on Helios. If we could get Ethan to—" Richard cut him off. "Cole is irrelevant. He's gone. And if he knows what's good for him, he'll stay gone." But even as he said it, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the man he'd fired. The one who had been right. 2 weeks later, Ethan and Mark managed to land their first small project, a supply chain audit for a mid-sized apparel company that was desperate to clean up its image after a sweatshop scandal. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. The two of them worked 16-hour days out of Ethan's apartment, building spreadsheets, making calls, and designing a new ethical sourcing program for their client. One night, as they ordered cheap takeout for the third day in a row, Mark grinned. "You know what? This feels good. Like we're actually doing something that matters." For the first time in years, he wondered if Ethan Cole had been right about everything. A month later, True North Solutions was gaining traction. Their first client had signed a renewal contract, and word of mouth was spreading. Ethan and Mark hired 2 more people, setting up a modest office in a converted warehouse. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. And Ethan could feel the momentum building. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang. Mark opened the door and froze. Ethan," he called. Ethan stepped out of his office and felt his stomach drop. Standing in the doorway, wearing a tailored suit but looking nothing like the powerful CEO Ethan remembered, was Richard Kane. "Hello, Ethan," Richard said quietly. The room went still. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. Richard took a deep breath. "I need your help." Mark looked like he was about to laugh. "You're kidding, right? You fired him. You ruined his life." Richard ignored him. "The SEC is about to shut Kane Industries down completely. I've lost investors, employees, everything. But I think you can save it. Or at least what's left of it." Ethan stared at him, stunned. "Why would I help you?" "Because I was wrong," Richard admitted, his voice breaking for the first time. "And because the people who work for me don't deserve to pay for my mistakes." Ethan crossed his arms. "And if I say no?" Richard looked at the floor. "Then Kane Industries is finished, and hundreds of people will lose their jobs." The room was silent. Ethan didn't answer. Not yet. Ethan stared at Richard Kane for a long moment. The man standing in the doorway was not the same confident, untouchable CEO who had fired him with a smirk. This Richard looked older, his shoulders heavier, as if the weight of his own decisions had finally crushed him. Ethan's arms stayed crossed. "Why should I care? You didn't care about me when you threw me out like trash." Richard exhaled slowly. "You're right. I was arrogant. I thought I was untouchable. But I was wrong. Ethan, I need someone who actually knows how to run this company ethically. Someone people trust. I need you." Mark stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes.
No way.
"You think you can walk in here, say a few sorry words, and Ethan's just going to fix your mess? Get out." But Ethan didn't move. Richard's gaze was fixed on him. "If you don't help me, Kane Industries dies. And I deserve that. But the people who work there, the same ones who cheered for you when you stood up for what's right, they'll lose everything. Hundreds of families will be affected." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You should have thought about them before you cut corners and lied to investors." "I know," Richard said quietly. "And I can't change the past. But maybe you can help me change the future." The office was silent except for the hum of the old air conditioner. Ethan finally said, "I'll think about it." Richard nodded. "That's all I can ask." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth."
I'm sorry, Ethan.
And then he was gone. Later that night, Ethan sat in his apartment, staring at the city lights. Sophie called, her voice full of cautious hope. So, what are you going to do? I don't know, Ethan admitted. Part of me wants to tell him to deal with the mess he created. But the employees, they don't deserve this. You've always cared about people more than pride, Sophie said softly. That's what makes you different. Ethan hung up and opened his laptop. He began typing a list. Everything Kane Industries had done wrong and what it would take to make things right. The list grew long, and by the time he finished, one thing was clear. If he agreed to help Richard Kane, it wouldn't be as a consultant. It would be on his terms. The next morning, Richard was waiting in the lobby of True North Solutions when Ethan arrived. Have you decided? Richard asked, hope flickering in his eyes. Yes, Ethan said. But I have conditions. Richard straightened. Name them. First, I want full authority over operations. No interference from you or Derek. Second, we implement complete transparency, internal audits, fair wages, sustainable practices. And third, we rebuild the company from the ground up, even if it means shrinking it to half its size. Richard hesitated. Ethan, that could cost millions. We'll lose investors. Ethan stepped closer. You've already lost them. This is the only way forward. Richard's eyes searched Ethan's face. Then he nodded. Agreed. But I want one thing in return. Ethan's brow furrowed. What? Teach me, Richard said. Teach me how to run a company the right way. Because I forgot somewhere along the line. Ethan studied him for a moment, then extended his hand.
Fine.
But we do this together or not at all. Richard shook his hand firmly. Together. Within days, Ethan walked back into the towering headquarters of Kane Industries, not as a disgraced employee, but as a man who had the power to reshape everything. Employees whispered when they saw him. Some even clapped quietly, remembering the analyst who had been fired for telling the truth. Derek Walsh was less welcoming. He cornered Ethan in the hallway, his smirk thin and cold. So, you're back, Derek said. Here to play hero? I'm here to clean up your mess, Ethan replied. Derek's smile faded. This company doesn't need your morality lessons, Cole. It needs profits. You think you're going to save us? You'll bury us faster. Ethan stepped closer. The old way buried us already. Get out of my way, Derek. For the first few weeks, Ethan worked around the clock. He and Mark assembled a new operations team, cut ties with corrupt suppliers, and reached out to ethical investors. It wasn't easy. They faced resistance at every turn. Some employees feared change. Investors doubted the company could recover. And Derek Walsh, sensing his influence slipping, began quietly undermining Ethan's plans. But slowly, things began to shift. A small group of loyal employees rallied behind Ethan, inspired by his integrity. New investors cautiously returned. Customers responded positively to the company's public pledge to reform. One night, as Ethan reviewed spreadsheets in the CEO's office, Richard stepped in holding 2 cups of coffee. You've changed this place, Richard said, handing him a cup. Ethan shook his head. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're on the right path. Richard sat down across from him. You know, I used to think you were naive, that your honesty would hold you back. But now I see it's the only thing keeping us afloat. Ethan met his gaze. It's not about me. It's about giving people a company they can believe in again. Just as he said it, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Mark. Ethan, we have a problem. Derek's been leaking info to the press. And I think he's meeting with our competitors. Ethan's stomach dropped. He looked at Richard, who had already guessed what the message said. Derek, Richard muttered. I should have seen this coming. Ethan stood. We can't let him destroy everything we've built. But Derek Walsh wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was about to make a move that could ruin Kane Industries forever. And Ethan knew they had one chance to stop him. Ethan stood in the dimly lit office, phone still clutched in his hand. Mark's text burned in his mind. Derek's been leaking info to the press. And I think he's meeting with our competitors. He turned to Richard Kane, whose expression had hardened. I should have known Derek would do something like this, Richard muttered. He's been desperate to hold on to his power ever since you came back. Ethan's jaw tightened. We can't let him undo everything we've built. If he leaks confidential data or misleads investors, the company won't survive. Richard straightened, his voice low but firm. Then we catch him in the act. Tonight. Hours later, Ethan and Mark sat in the back of Mark's old sedan, parked across from a sleek downtown restaurant. Derek Walsh was inside, having dinner with a man Ethan recognized from industry reports, the COO of Helios Global, Kane Industries' largest competitor. Of course, Ethan whispered. He's selling us out to Helios. Mark adjusted the small recording device in his jacket pocket. Once we get proof, we'll take it to the board. They'll have no choice but to remove Derek permanently. Ethan glanced at his watch. Let's move. If we wait too long, Derek might cover his tracks. They entered the restaurant casually, slipping into a booth close enough to overhear Derek's conversation. I'm telling you, Kane Industries is on the edge, Derek was saying, his voice smug. If you back me, I can take control and steer the company into a merger with Helios. Ethan Cole won't see it coming. The Helios executive nodded. And what about the reforms he's been pushing? Investors like the new image. Derek scoffed. That's temporary PR fluff. Once I'm in charge, we'll go back to doing things the profitable way. Ethan's fists clenched. He looked at Mark, who subtly pressed the record button. They had what they needed. But before they could leave, Derek's gaze swept the restaurant and landed on Ethan. His eyes narrowed. Cole? What the hell are you doing here? Ethan stood slowly. Stopping you. Derek's smirk vanished. You've been spying on me? Call it protecting the company, Ethan said. Derek rose from the table, his voice low and venomous. You think you've changed anything since you came back? You're just Richard's pet project. Once the board sees you can't turn this company around, you'll be out on the street. Again. Ethan stepped closer. We'll see about that. The next morning, Ethan and Richard called an emergency board meeting. The directors sat around the long mahogany table, tension thick in the air. Richard stood at the head of the table, Ethan beside him. We're here to discuss Derek Walsh's betrayal, Richard began. Derek, seated at the far end, scoffed. Betrayal? Or is this just a convenient way to get rid of me because Ethan doesn't like competition? Ethan didn't flinch. We have proof, he said, placing Mark's phone on the table. He pressed play. The room fell silent as Derek's voice filled the boardroom. If you back me, I can take control and steer the company into a merger with Helios. Ethan Cole won't see it coming. Derek's face drained of color. Enough, one of the directors said. This is unacceptable. Another added, Derek Walsh, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Derek glared at Ethan, his voice a low hiss. You think you've won, but you have no idea how fragile this company is. One wrong move, and it all comes crashing down. He stood, shoulders rigid, and stormed out of the room. After the meeting, Richard turned to Ethan. You saved us again. I don't know how to thank you. Ethan shook his head. We're not out of the woods yet. We still need to rebuild trust with investors, employees, and customers. And we have to do it the right way. Richard nodded. I'm with you. All the way. In the weeks that followed, Ethan worked harder than ever. He met with employees one-on-one, listening to their concerns. He implemented fair wage adjustments and launched an internal ethics committee. True North Solutions partnered with Kane Industries to oversee all supply chains, ensuring every step of the process was transparent. Slowly, the company's reputation began to recover. News outlets praised the reforms, and customers returned. Investors, once hesitant, began expressing interest again. For the first time in years, Kane Industries wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. One afternoon, Richard stepped into Ethan's office with a letter in his hand. It's from the SEC, he said, smiling. The investigation is officially closed. No penalties. We're in the clear. Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him. That's incredible. Richard extended his hand. None of this would have happened without you. You brought integrity back to this company. And I want you to stay, not as an employee, but as a partner. Co-CEO. Ethan froze. What? You've earned it, Richard said. You're the reason Kane Industries still exists, and I want us to build the future together. Ethan thought about the years he'd spent being dismissed, undervalued, fired for being honest.
And now,
He nodded slowly. All right, but only if we keep doing things the right way. Richard smiled. That's the only way forward. That evening, Ethan visited Sophie. She was sitting on the porch, sipping tea. You look lighter, she said. I am, Ethan admitted. For the first time in a long time. Sophie smiled. You didn't just get your job back. You changed everything. That's what honesty does, Ethan. It changes things. But even as she said it, Ethan knew the work wasn't over. There would always be people like Derek Walsh, willing to cut corners for power. But now, he had the power to fight back, and to prove that integrity could win in the long run. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the headquarters to find employees gathered in the lobby, applauding. He paused, stunned. Richard stepped forward and handed him a framed plaque. Ethan Cole, the man who reminded us what matters most. Ethan swallowed hard. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Richard smiled. This is just the beginning. The morning light spilled through the glass walls of Kane Industries, painting the freshly renovated lobby in a golden glow. Ethan Cole stood at the top of the sweeping staircase, looking down at the bustling activity below. Employees who had once walked these halls with uncertainty now moved with purpose and optimism. It was a sight Ethan had only dreamed of when he was fired months ago. Now he was back, not as a disgraced analyst, but as co-CEO. And he had a company to rebuild. He walked into the boardroom where Richard Kane was waiting with a stack of papers. Morning, Richard said, a smile tugging at his lips. You ready for your first official day as partner? Ethan chuckled softly. I feel like I've been working this job for months already. Richard slid the papers across the table. Contracts, proposals, investor updates. But there's something else I wanted to show you first. He opened a folder and handed Ethan a letter. Ethan scanned the contents, then looked up, stunned. This is a scholarship program? Richard nodded. For students who want to study business ethics. Fully funded. It was your idea months ago. I thought we'd make it official. Ethan smiled. This is exactly what we should be doing. Building something that lasts. As they finalized the paperwork, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about proving that doing the right thing, no matter the cost, could change the world. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited True North Solutions, the small company he and Mark had built from scratch during his lowest point. Now, True North was thriving as Kane Industries' official auditing partner, with a growing list of clients. Mark greeted him with a grin. So, Mr. Co-CEO, how does it feel to be back on top? Ethan laughed. It's not about being on top. It's about making sure we never forget why we started this. Mark nodded. And Derek Walsh? Heard he's trying to start his own company. Ethan shrugged. Good luck to him. We've got work to do. Before he left, Ethan gathered the True North team in the conference room. I just want to say thank you, he told them. When I lost everything, you believed in me. And because of that, we built something real. Something honest. Don't ever underestimate the power of that. The room erupted in applause. That evening, Ethan stopped by Sophie's house. She was in the kitchen, making dinner, and smiled when she saw him. You look happy, she said. I am, Ethan admitted. For the first time in a long time. Sophie set down the spoon she was holding and hugged him tightly. You never stopped being honest, even when it cost you everything. And look where it got you. Ethan smiled. It wasn't just me. It was the people who believed in me, like you. As they ate dinner, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey. He remembered the humiliation of being escorted out of Kane Industries with a box in his arms. The nights he'd lain awake wondering if honesty had ruined his life. And now, he was proof that integrity could win. A week later, Kane Industries held a company-wide event to unveil their new mission statement. Employees filled the auditorium, buzzing with anticipation. Richard Kane stepped onto the stage first, his voice steady. When I started this company, I lost sight of what mattered. I let greed cloud my judgment, and it nearly destroyed us. But one man reminded me that honesty and integrity are the foundation of real success. He turned toward Ethan, who walked onto the stage to a standing ovation. Ethan stepped up to the microphone, his throat tight. "I never imagined I'd be standing here again," he began. "But this isn't about me. This is about all of us. We have a chance to build a company that does more than make money, one that makes a difference." He paused, scanning the faces of employees who had endured so much uncertainty. I was fired for being honest, and at the time, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. But now I see it was the best, because it led to this moment, to this opportunity to start over together. The crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan stepped back, his eyes meeting Richard's. And for the first time, the two men understood each other completely. Months passed and Kane Industries transformed. Employee satisfaction soared. Profits stabilized. And the company became a model for ethical practices in business, earning recognition from major industry organizations. But Ethan never let the success go to his head. He still rode the bus some mornings, still visited the small coffee shop where he'd once sat jobless and uncertain. And one evening, as he walked past that same bench where he had sat with his box of belongings months ago, he stopped. He remembered the pain, the humiliation, the uncertainty, and he smiled, because that was the day everything truly began. Ethan Cole knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Honesty would always be his compass. And as long as he stayed true to that, he could face anything.